Hey everybody, welcome back. Let's finish up this namespace and resource records pair of videos. So as a gentle reminder, this is what a zone file looks like. And we just want to take a look at this to remind ourselves about the things that are in there, because this is really what we're going to talk about in this particular video. So we've got, the beginning part of the stuff, right? The time to live. We'll see what that means here. We know about the origin statement. We've got the start of authority portion, and then all of our resource records. This one happens to be a forward zone, but it doesn't really matter because we just want to remember what's in these things. Well, now that we've done a build and we talked about the namespace and we talked about the rules for labels and the name itself, we know that those tie back to this thing called a resource record. Well, what is a resource record? Well, a resource record is the thing that we find in the files, and each node or host in a domain has a particular way to be referenced, both by IP address and maybe by some other information. And when a query comes in, a query is of a particular type. And so we're looking for a particular type of information from the name server. And so this is what the resource record is all about. What are you looking for, and do I have that kind of information? Now, in the resource records, one of the big fields is the type field. And we'll see here if we look at the RFC, we'll see that there's a lot of different types, but these are some of the major ones, right? We have an A record, an address record, CNAME, host info, mail record, name server record, start of authority. But let's just take a quick look at the laundry list of names or types that are in the RFC. So when we make a resource record, one of the things that we put in there is the type that it is. Now there's a class, we'll get to that here in a second, but there are a bunch of different types that we can use. You can see that there's quite a few of them, there's 16 of them. But here are some of the common ones, right? We have an address record, we have a name server record. There's our start of authority type. And then down here at the bottom we have a mail record. And so these are some of the common ones. Today we're also going to talk about the CNAME or canonical name. But that's just sort of an indication that there's a lot of different types of information that you can pull from a resource record, or maybe I should say there's a bunch of different types that can describe what kind of resource record we're looking at, and a query can be made for several different types of information. Now the other thing that's not quite as obvious is that there's a class out there. Now all of the records that we've been looking at and all the files that we've been looking at have an IN in there somewhere, in uppercase or lowercase, usually uppercase, and that's the internet system. Well, you kind of would think, well, of course it's the internet system. What else would it be? Well, as we know, historically, there's been lots of different protocols, lots of different standards, lots of different networking models, for that matter. There is another one that's kind of fun to talk about, and that is the chaos system. Now, that's not what this video is about, but if you want to have a little bit of fun, take a look at the RFC. There is actually a chaos class that's there, and there's a little blurb about it on Wikipedia, and you can actually look it up in the in RFCs and other documentation too. But yeah, chaos system. We'll take a quick look here. So here are the class values, right? All of these possibilities, and this is the one that we use, right? Makes sense. We have the internet, IP version 4, blah blah blah. But right here is the chaos class. Well, is that really a thing? It sure is. So back in the 1970s, whole different way of operating. So there's ChaosNet right there. So if you want to have a little bit of fun, read that there was actually a thing called the chaos networking, and more importantly, that it's not always the case that the way we do things today is the way that we've always done them, or that there aren't other ideas out there. Now let's see if we can put a little more meaning to some of the other fields that we see. The time to live. Well, the TTL right at the beginning of this file, now there's some other timers there, we'll talk about those, but the time to live field is how long a resource record is valid for. How long do you want to hold on to this information? We don't always make requests of everything that we want to know. Sometimes we store the information, and so the time to live tells you really how long you ought to hang on to something before you ought to have it refreshed. Now the R data, okay, so we do a class and a type with a resource record, and then the R data is whatever the information is. So it's not enough just say I'd like this class of information and I want this type. What's the information that you're actually going to get back? That's the R data. Now, the very common one, when we do a forward lookup, right, we're looking up a name, give me the IP address. The R data would be the IP address. But of course, there's the other types that we've already seen. So let's start with the start of authority record. Good place to start. So at the beginning, we can see that we are a class, internet, makes sense. Start of authority, resource record type. Then we've got the name server associated with this. So lamborghini.it.rit.edu would be the name server, and then root.it.rit.edu would just be the contact. Now, we've got this set of timers associated with this. Now, a lot of times this is just, how you interact with this particular server. The serial number is just a number, but a lot of times it's a date, and it tells us when this file was either created or updated. So it's a good idea if you're an administrator. Every time you touch this file, you add things, fix things, you should update this serial number, which is related to the next one, right? The refresh in seconds. If you're talking to a name server for any reason, periodically you ought to check back and make sure that you have the latest and greatest updated information. So that's sort of a value that says, it's time to see if they updated the name server. Now, if you can't talk to the name server, well, you ought to periodically go back and make sure that the name server is still there. So that's what the retry is all about. The expire, that is all about, is this thing really the authoritative server? If you can't talk to a server in that amount of time, it starts to start wondering if it's actually authoritative or if there's another server out there. And then the minimum is really about a minimum time to live for a particular resource record information. It's related to the time to live. Now we'll take a quick look at the RFC official definitions so that you just don't have the shortened versions here. So we'll take a look at that right now. So as we can see, we're looking at a start of authority resource record format. And then these are all of the timers. Now don't forget there's the minimum way down here. So this collection of timers right here are the ones that we've dealt with. So those, I'll leave those on the screen for a couple of seconds. In case you want to pause the video. All right, let's go back. Now the two most common records that we probably look at are the name server records and the address records. And here's a bunch of examples here. Anytime you include the name server type, the expectation is that this particular name is going to be a name server for the domain. And you can have a couple of them, you can have one, but of course we talked about before, it's good to have a backup. But there we have it, that's the name server record. So the next record is just an address record, pretty straightforward. Now this is a fully qualified domain name, but of course it could just be Lamborghini if we had an origin statement in there. So we might get rid of the it.rt.edu. And then, of course, we've got the IP address way over here. And so the whole point of an address record is to associate an IP address with a name. Now, the point of records are for the reverse lookup. So we would have an IP address on the left-hand side, class, and then the type, and then the domain name that this goes with. So we would find these all in our reverse lookup file or our reverse zone. Now, one of the reasons that we have the ordering that we do, that crazy internet address.arpa format, is because if we think about or remember where the most specific part of that is, well, in a fully qualified domain name, the most specific thing is on the left. But in an IP address, the most specific thing is on the right. And so that's why we flop it so the format is the same. And the last thing I'll mention here is that if we had an origin statement here, right, we wouldn't need the 129.21 or the 129.21.21 depending on how big the address space was. And here is just an example of a forward zone. Here we see all of the things that we just talked about. I'll just point out here that we've got a couple of different ways that you can represent all of those numbers associated with the timers. And I also throw in a good source. In addition to the man pages and all the literature that's out there, these videos, here's another source that I thought I would add for this particular slide. And hey, look, reverse zone. Same thing, right? An origin, reverse IP address thingy, right? That's the internet-addr, right? Internet address.arpa format. And then here is what the pointer records would look like. And we can notice here that I've just used 30 and 31. That's because I have an origin statement up here. If I didn't have an origin statement, they would be the full IP address over there. And now, canonical name or CNAME records. So every time I think about this, I go to this story that Ron White does in his stand-up, right? Do you have any aliases? They call me Tater Salad. I don't know why that just cracks me up. Okay, so what is a canonical name all about? It associates an alias with a canonical name. So when we have a CNAME record, we have another way to reference some object that's out there. So in this case, www.it.rit.edu is the same thing as lamborghini.it.rit.edu. They point to each other. So in the build example, I had a record for, I think it was client 1. And then I had a CNAME record that was Dr. H. And so Dr. H pointed back to client 1. And so that's the way that it works. Canonical simply means, right, it's a fancy name. It's just of or forming to canon, so we can say that's the rule set that we're going to use, but we have this procedure that we're going to use to reference. So it's really just a formatted way to say, look, I've got this resource record that's an address record or a pointer record, and I've got this other thing that I want to use to refer to it, but I've got to have a link to that. So if I have, my name server.bruce.com, and then it has an IP address, but I want to call it Gus. Well, I can have a way to call the name server Gus and refer back to that if I want to. Now, a lot of times when we make CNAME records, we say that we're making an alias for something. And as we can see from our dictionary definition, otherwise known as is an alias definition. But the fun part about it is what the RFC actually has to say. So in existing systems, hosts and other resources often have several names that identify the same resource. We see this all the time. For example, you give a fully qualified domain name to a printer, and then it has an IP address, but nobody remembers that. Everybody remembers it as black and white 1 or color 1, color 2, something like that. But here's the fun thing in terms of behavior. So when you have a CNAME record, you can look it up either by, the address record or by the pointer, or you can look something up by the CNAME. And when that happens, a lot of times that will trigger a second lookup. So I'm looking up color2.rit.edu as the printer that I want to use, but I find out that that's actually a canonical name or an alias for something else. So now I've got to do a lookup on that. And down below we see some examples that are used right in the RFC. By the way, 3.6.2 is the section of the RFC that refers to this stuff. So here's a little more information on that actual process, right? While attempting to resolve a particular request, the resolver may find that the name in question is an alias or a CNAME record. So what might happen is the name server will tell the client, hey, what you just looked up is something else. In most cases, the resolver simply restarts the query with the new name. When performing the general function, the resolver should not pursue aliases when the CNAME RR matches the query type. So if you were actually looking that thing up as an alias, there's no reason to redo that. So it depends on what you're actually after, right? If you just wanted to find the actual CNAME record, if that was the actual query, then you'll just get the information back. But if you were actually after, what it actually points to, then it might result in an extra lookup. Whew, well, that'll do it for namespace and resource records. As you can see, there's lots of different kinds of resource records out there. And as we can see now, that query types might reference the particular type of resource record that you're looking for. And so it makes a difference. And if we have CNAME lookups, that might actually result in an extra lookup that we didn't expect. Or when we're looking at a trace and we're trying to understand what's happening, that's helpful to sort of unfold the layers of the query. Well, that's the namespace and resource records, but we still have servers, resolvers, types of queries to do, and the protocol to talk about. Hey, like and subscribe if I help. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and may your packets always find that resource record they're looking for.